If we had had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so.
He said, essentially, you're innocent. I'm innocent of all charges. I think Mueller is a true never-Trumper. He's somebody that dislikes Donald Trump.
Bob Mueller identified some episodes. He did not reach a conclusion. He provided both sides of the issue, and his conclusion was he wasn't exonerating the president, but he wasn't finding a crime either.
Just some of what we witnessed, so it's perhaps no accident that the president chose to close out this week by letting us know on Twitter he'll soon be officially announcing his, quote, second-term presidential run. This week has called on all of Trump's message-shaping skills, unencumbered by the facts, with a helpful assist from his attorney general. And so with us tonight, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and presidential historian Jon Meacham. He's the co-author of the recent book, Impeachment and American History, and his latest work is out next month, co-authored with Tim McGraw, Songs of America, Patriotism, Protest, and the Music That Made a Nation. Jon, we try to talk to you at least once a week, and I've been thinking about you a lot this week because it strikes me that Robert Mueller is the kind of person historians love. This guy of probity and rectitude, the bearing of a sphinx, doesn't say a word for 2 years. Calvin Coolidge talked more than this guy, and yet is the stark truth that historians will have to record that he might have been bested by a guy, a president, by the way, who adheres to no such rules of behavior.
It's funny. Basically, our public life has become a bar fight. And who knew it would be the Star Wars Cantina bar fight? It's unquestionably Mueller comes from an entirely different ethos than the incumbent president. He comes from the world of George H.W. Bush, from Dean Acheson, as you say, the figures who you can just absolutely imagine having 2 martinis at lunch and then deciding to project power across the world. And that world had its limitations, but it had a compelling sense of public duty. And essentially what we saw this week was the former director of the FBI, a man who's given his life to protecting the country, arguing in a antiquated way, and it's tragically antiquated, let me be very clear there, that he thought people should read his 400-page report. And he basically, I said this with our colleague Ari Melber this week, he brought a knife to a gunfight. And then Ari improved the line. He basically brought a book to a Twitter fight. And so I think when we look back on this presidency, this moment in our history, this is going to be, this exchange, this standoff between Robert Mueller and Trump will be one of those iconic moments where you can see how passion and ideology have taken over from reason and probity.
How will we know if Nancy Pelosi's standard, ironclad support for impeachment, is reached? Do you have any other lever to pull other than us looking at public polling?
No, the only, when I heard that, I thought of Potter Stewart's great definition of pornography, Justice Stewart, who said you know it when you see it. Yeah. And by setting that standard in what is inherently a political process, the former general counsel you just had made this point exactly right. Impeachment is not a judicial process. It has the trappings of it. The House is a grand jury, the Senate is a trial, the Chief Justice comes down and sits. But the rules are very different. And I think what Speaker Pelosi's doing, and I personally as a citizen disagree with it respectfully, is she believes that if she were to proceed with this politically, that ultimately it would probably strengthen Trump, because he would be able to run, because you're not going to get, what, 12, 15 senators, Republican senators, to vote to convict the guy. That's just not possible. So he would run as if he had been exonerated. There was a famous local politician in my hometown of in East Tennessee who was indicted, stood trial, and ran for re-election. He was the police commissioner, by the way, ran for re-election on the grounds that he had been declared innocent by a court of law. Have you ever been declared innocent by a court of law? And that was the platform which propelled him forward. And I suspect that Speaker Pelosi is there. If I were a member of Congress, I would at least support opening House Judiciary Committee hearings so you could give Mueller's reading assignment to the country a bit more of a chance, where you could adjudicate this.
And I'm still not done. I want to circle back to Mueller because you mentioned Atchison, you mentioned 41. Let me also throw into the DNA pile, he has some of the blood of Chesty Puller, the great Marine, because let's not forget the 74-year-old man who stood at that lectern this week has a bullet wound in him from the North Vietnamese, and that makes him of different wiring. The question is, will he be content with this as the after-action report on all of his hard work, on 2 years of his life that he thought was going to be private life?
Well, I thought it was extraordinary that he said anything at all. And once he did, he basically also told us he never wanted to speak again. And that does seem characteristic. There is this, there was once upon a time in political life where reticence was a virtue. That seems like Thermopylae now. It's so far away. My own view of this is, if we were writing this, you have two contrasting scenes, two contrasting people. As you say, you have a wounded Marine veteran who's given his life to public service, who's making a sober statement about what his report said, that he, to a fault perhaps, followed Justice Department guidelines. You know, that's the morning at the Justice Department. And then classically, you would say, on the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue, Donald Trump was tweeting. And that's where we are. And it's not just about them. I understand the focus on Mueller, obviously, but we have to figure out a way. The 51% of the country that tends to drive things needs to decide, is that level of behavior in the presidency what we want to endure? And are you willing to set a precedent where a president gets away with the things that Mueller laid out? And the Attorney General can dismiss it all he wants, but the facts are there. I think it's a really interesting question about if not now, when? If you don't proceed to impeach him, or at least to have hearings and raise the question, not just about his fitness for office. This isn't about that. This is about his overt attempts to obstruct justice. If you're not going to do it now, Lord knows what you'd have to do to get a majority of the House of Representatives to proceed. It's a very troubling moment.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.